The line for first-class boarding seemed to shine with money, expensive watches catching the fluorescent airport lights, designer luggage rolling smoothly across the carpet. Among these wealthy travelers stood Dian, a 17-year-old boy from South Chicago, looking both excited and out of place in his neat but simple hoodie and jeans, worn sneakers, and backpack covered in coding stickers. This was Dian's first time flying alone, and definitely his first time in business class. The ticket had been a gift from Tech Future, the company that offered him a summer internship after his artificial intelligence algorithm caught their attention. As he handed his boarding pass to the attendant, he couldn't help but notice a few raised eyebrows from the well-dressed people behind him. "Boarding Group 1?" The attendant confirmed with a smile, noticing his nervousness. "Yes, you're in the right line. Enjoy your flight." Dian made his way down the jet bridge, his stomach doing flips that had nothing to do with flying. He found his seat, a wide leather chair that looked more like something from a fancy office than an airplane. Across the aisle sat an older couple in their 50s, dressed like they'd stepped out of a luxury magazine. The woman wore a cream-colored suit and pearls, while the man had on a tailored blazer and gold cufflinks. Next to them were their friends, another couple dressed just as expensively. "I believe you're in 3A," the flight attendant helped Dian, showing him how to store his backpack. "This button reclines your seat, and here's the menu for today's service." Dian thanked her and settled in, immediately noticing the sideways glances from the couples across the aisle. He pretended to study the menu, but the unfamiliar food terms made him hesitate. "Excuse me," he asked the passing flight attendant, "what's the duck confit?" Before the attendant could answer, the pearl-wearing woman across the aisle let out a small dramatic sigh. She turned to her husband and whispered something, though not quietly enough. "I wonder how someone like him ended up in business class. Must be one of those diversity programs the airlines are doing now." Her husband nodded, adding, "Probably using his mother's airline miles. You know these kids, they think they deserve everything without working for it." Heat rushed to Dian's face. He wanted to tell them about the thousands of hours he'd spent coding in his bedroom after school, teaching himself programming languages, while his single mom worked double shifts. He wanted to mention the scholarship he'd earned to the Tech Summer program where he developed his algorithm. But instead, he just gripped the menu tighter, his knuckles turning white. The flight attendant, overhearing the comments, gave Dian a sympathetic look and explained the menu with extra care. "The duck confit is delicious. It's slow-cooked duck leg. But I recommend the grilled salmon if you're not sure." Dian nodded, grateful for her kindness, while trying to ignore the continued whispers. The four wealthy travelers had formed a small conspiracy of judgment, exchanging knowing looks as they discussed standards these days and how things used to be just loudly enough for him to hear. What they didn't notice was the young Asian woman sitting directly behind them, Lin, a well-known tech journalist heading to cover the same conference where Dian would be presenting. She'd been recording audio and the flight had been smooth for the first hour. Dian tried to focus on the movie playing on his screen, but his mind kept drifting to the conference ahead. He practiced his presentation 100 times in front of his bedroom mirror. Would all these tech professionals take a 17-year-old seriously? The thought made his stomach tighten. Just then, the plane shuddered. The seatbelt sign dinged on as the captain's voice crackled over the speakers. "Folks, we're hitting some turbulence. Flight attendants, please take your seats." The plane dropped suddenly, then bumped upward. Dian's hand jerked, sending his half-full orange juice tumbling. The plastic cup bounced off his tray table and splashed across his jeans and the edge of the aisle carpet. "Oh no," he muttered, grabbing for the napkins. The reaction from across the aisle was immediate and dramatic. The woman in pearls gasped as if someone had set off a firecracker. "Harold!" She cried to her husband, pulling her designer purse off the floor and onto her lap. "Look what he's done." She made a show of inspecting her bag for droplets, though the juice hadn't gone anywhere near her. Her husband, Harold, shook his head with obvious disgust. "You'd think they'd teach basic manners before letting people into business class." Their friends joined in, the woman tutting loudly while her husband added, "First time on an airplane, clearly." Dian's face burned as he desperately wiped at his jeans. A small puddle of juice had settled into the carpet by his foot. He pressed napkins into it, aware that everyone around him was watching. Some people just don't know how to behave in civil. The plane touched down with a gentle bump. Dion kept his eyes on the window, watching San Francisco appear through the morning fog. He'd spent the last hour of the flight trying to make himself invisible, hunched over his notebook, scribbling code ideas to distract. By evening, Harold's world was crumbling around him. He sat in his hotel suite, tie loosened, staring at his phone as it buzzed nonstop. His wife paced the room, her face tight with worry. "How bad is it?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Bad," Harold replied, scrolling through endless notifications. Ling's podcast episode just dropped. Privilege at 30,000 feet. She released it early. He pressed play, and their own voices filled the room, every nasty comment, every snide remark about Dion, perfectly preserved. The recording was crystal clear. There was no denying it was them. "She didn't even wait until tomorrow," his wife whispered. "And she used our names." Harold nodded grimly. "Full names, where we work, everything." His phone rang, the CEO of his financial firm. Harold took a deep breath and answered. "Harold, what the hell is going on?" His boss demanded. "I've got Tech Future threatening to pull their account." "Do you have any idea how much money that is?" "Sir, I can explain." "Explain what?" "That you publicly humiliated a tech prodigy our firm has been trying to connect with for months. That you're on record making prejudiced comments about a kid who's just revolutionized artificial intelligence. Half our clients are tech companies, Harold." The call ended with Harold being placed on administrative leave pending investigation. In normal terms, he was one step away from being fired. Across town, their friends weren't faring any better. 2 clients had already called to end their contracts with the PR firm. No company wanted to be associated with the scandal that was spreading like wildfire across social media. #Privilege at 30,000 feet was trending. Clips from Ling's podcast were being shared millions of times. News websites had picked up the story, complete with photos of Harold and his Groot from their social media accounts placed next to pictures of Dion accepting his award at the conference. "The cars here," Harold's wife said flatly, looking out the window at the black SUV waiting below. They had hired a crisis management team, but even getting to their office would be a challenge. Reporters had gathered outside the hotel. Harold checked his email one last time before leaving. His inbox was flooded, but one subject line made him pause. "Board meeting regarding your position. Urgent." He was the chairman of an education foundation that provided scholarships to underprivileged students. The irony wasn't lost on him. Downstairs, they slipped through the kitchen to avoid the cameras out front. Even the hotel staff gave them cold looks. Everyone had heard the story by now. "Keep your heads down," the crisis manager instructed as they rushed to the waiting car. "Don't speak to anyone." But someone was waiting by the vehicle, Ling, notebook in hand. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitfield, care to comment on the recording? Or perhaps on the statement Tech Future just released condemning your behavior?" Harold pushed past her, helping his wife into the car before climbing in himself. Through the tinted windows, he could see more reporters arriving, cameras flashing. "This will pass," his wife said, not sounding convinced. "It has to." Harold's phone buzzed with a text from his daughter in college. "Dad, how could you? Everyone here is talking about it. My roommate recognized our family photo I have on my desk. I'm so embarrassed." Meanwhile, across San Francisco, Dion was having dinner with the Tech Future executives when his phone lit up with a call from his mom. "Baby, have you seen the news? You're everywhere. Some podcast about what happened on your flight." Dion hadn't expected things to blow up so quickly. He'd almost forgotten about the wealthy passengers in the excitement of the conference. "It's okay, Mom, I'm fine." "Those people," his mother said, her voice tight with anger. "Who do they think they are?" "It doesn't matter," Dion replied. "My algorithm is what matters." And guess what? Tech Future just increased their offer after my presentation today. Later that night, alone in his hotel room, Dion scrolled through the hundreds of messages flooding his social media. Most were supportive, calling him an inspiration. Some shared similar experiences of being judged based on appearance. A notification popped up. Ling had sent him a message. "The world is listening now. This isn't just about one flight anymore. Would you be willing to be interviewed about your experiences and your work?" People need to hear your voice, not just your story. Dion thought about Harold's face when the captain announced his name. He thought about all the times he'd been underestimated, all the times he had to work twice as hard to be taken seriously. He typed back, "Yes, I have a lot to say." Across town, Harold stared at the ceiling in his hotel room, unable to sleep as his phone continued to buzz with bad news. By morning, his world would be unrecognizable, and it was entirely his own doing. 1 week later, Harold sat alone in his home office, staring at the email that had officially ended his 30-year career. The investigation had been quick and merciless. Former employees had come forward with stories of Harold's past remarks, revealing a pattern that the company could no longer ignore. His resignation had been strongly encouraged by the board. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 3 times. His wife was upstairs packing for her sister's house in Portland. She needed space, she'd said. The charity boards she'd once proudly led had all asked her to step down. Friends weren't returning calls. Their social circle had vanished overnight. Harold's phone buzzed with a text from his crisis manager. "Turn on Channel 8. Dion's interview with Ling is about to air." With a heavy sigh, Harold picked up the remote. The TV flickered to life, showing Dion sitting across from Ling in a sleek studio. The boy looked different now, more confident, wearing a tailored blue suit with sneakers, his posture relaxed but dignified. "So tell us about your algorithm," Ling was saying. "In simple terms, what does it do?" Dion smiled. "It helps schools identify students with high potential who might be overlooked because of test bias or lack of resources. The system finds hidden patterns in how kids solve problems, not just if they get the right answer." "And this is personal for you?" "Very. I was almost put in remedial classes in 5th grade because I finished tests too quickly. My teacher thought I was guessing. It took my mom fighting for me to get proper testing." Dion leaned forward. "There are brilliant kids out there who don't have someone to fight for them. My algorithm finds them." The camera zoomed in on Dion's face. "We need to talk about what happened on that flight," Ling said gently. "How did it feel when those passengers made those comments?" Dion was quiet for a moment. "It wasn't new. That's the sad part. What hurt most wasn't what they said, it was knowing how many other kids faced that judgment without the chance to prove them wrong like I did." Harold's stomach tightened as he watched. He never considered how his words might affect the boy. He'd seen Dion as nothing more than an inconvenience, an intrusion into his exclusive world. "The reaction to my podcast has been overwhelming," Ling continued. "Over 10 million downloads. Has anything positive come from this experience?" Dion nodded. Tech Future is creating a scholarship program for young coders from underrepresented backgrounds. They're calling it the 30K Feet Initiative. He smiled. Sometimes people need to hear how these things sound out loud to understand the impact. Harold turned off the TV, unable to watch anymore. His phone was filling with texts. Everyone had seen the interview. His daughter wrote that she was starting a diversity initiative at her college, inspired by What Not to Do, thanks to you, Dad. Across town, Harold's friends were facing their own collapse. Their PR firm had lost 5 major clients. Tech companies were publicly distancing themselves, making statements about inclusion and diversity. The wife had been removed from the museum board she'd worked years to join. Meanwhile, Dion's life had transformed in unexpected ways. A car waited outside his apartment in South Chicago to take him to another interview. His mother had been able to quit her second job. Universities were calling with scholarship offers. That evening, as his story aired nationwide, Dion sat with his mom in their small living room, surrounded by congratulation cards and flowers. "I'm proud of how you're handling this," his mother said, squeezing his hand. "Not everyone would be so gracious." "I'm not doing this to hurt them," Dion replied. "I want something good to come from it." His phone dinged with a notification. Tech Future had doubled the funding for the 30K Feet initiative after the interview aired. Schools in 5 cities would now be included. At the same time, Harold stared at his laptop screen, reading an email from his attorney. Their options were limited. The recording was legal. The damage to his reputation was severe and growing. Companies were starting internal investigations into workplace bias because of the story. Harold's name was becoming synonymous with privilege and prejudice. As night fell, two worlds continued to move in opposite directions, one rising with purpose and promise, the other crumbling under the weight of its own exposed foundation. And it had all begun with a single flight, a spilled drink, and the mistaken belief that appearances tell the whole story. 3 weeks had passed since the flight that changed everything. Harold sat in his living room surrounded by empty coffee cups and newspapers. The curtains were drawn against the occasional photographer, still hoping for a glimpse of the business-class bully, as social media had branded him. His phone rang, the crisis management team he could barely afford anymore. "We have a proposal," the team leader said without greeting. "A way to potentially salvage your reputation." "I'm listening," Harold said, his voice hoarse from lack of use. "A large donation to Dean's new foundation. We issue a carefully worded apology, express admiration for his work, and announce that you're funding 10 scholarships for underprivileged students." It would cost nearly $500,000, money that Harold could no longer spare so easily. His severance package had been minimal. His wife had frozen their joint accounts before leaving for her sister's. But what choice did he have? "Do it," he said. 2 hours later, a press release went out. Harold's team had crafted a statement filled with phrases like, "deeply regret my actions," and "learning opportunity," and committed to making amends. The donation would be publicly announced that afternoon. Harold expected relief to follow. Instead, he felt hollow. The apology wasn't really his. He hadn't written a word of it. The money wasn't a gesture of genuine remorse, but a desperate attempt to buy back his reputation. Even he could see the emptiness of it all. Across town, in a sleek conference room overlooking the bay, Dean sat with his new team reviewing the proposal. "It's a lot of money," his lawyer pointed out. "Could fund the summer coding camp for 3 years." Dean frowned, scrolling through the press release on his tablet. "But it doesn't feel right, does it? Using his money when he doesn't actually care about these kids." Ling, who had become something of a mentor to Dean, nodded in agreement. It's the easy way out for him. Write a check, problem solved. They were interrupted by a call from a major news outlet wanting Dean's response to Harold's generous donation. "I need to think about this," Dean said after hanging up. He stood by the window, looking out at the city. In just 3 weeks, his life had completely transformed. The algorithm sale had made him wealthy. Companies were fighting for his input. He'd even been invited to speak at his old school. But something about Harold's offer bothered him deeply. That evening, Dean released his official response. "I appreciate Mr. Whitfield's financial offer to the 30K Feet initiative. However, I believe real change requires more than money. If Mr. Whitfield is sincere about making amends, I would prefer he volunteer his time mentoring young people in South Chicago's tech program. Money is easy to give when you have it. Time and personal effort show true commitment to change." The statement hit the news cycle like a thunderbolt. Social media exploded with reactions, most praising Dean's wisdom and maturity. Suddenly, Harold's carefully crafted financial solution had backfired completely. "He wants me to what?" Harold nearly shouted when his crisis manager called with the news. "Go to South Chicago and teach kids." That's his response to $500,000. "The public loves it," the manager replied flatly. "They're calling him wise beyond his years, and you? Well, you've been reduced to a hashtag again. #MoneyCanBoy." Harold slumped into his chair. "So what now?" "You have 2 choices. Refuse and look even worse, or actually do what he's asking." The thought of traveling to South Chicago, of actually working with kids from neighborhoods he'd spent his life avoiding, made Harold's stomach turn. But the alternative, continued public shame, permanent career death, complete social isolation, was unbearable. "When would I start?" he asked quietly. The next day, news outlets reported that Harold Whitfield had accepted Dean Taylor's challenge and would begin volunteering at the South Chicago Tech Center the following week. Some called it a publicity stunt. Others wondered if it would make any difference. Most expected Harold to quit after a few days. Dean watched the coverage from his hotel room in New York, where he was meeting with education experts about expanding his program. "Do you think he'll actually show up?" his mother asked during their nightly call. "I don't know," Dean answered honestly. "But if he does, it might be the first real thing he's done in all of this." As he hung up, Dean received a message from Ling. "Your response to his donation was perfect. You've turned this whole situation into something meaningful, not just a scandal. P.S. We'll have a photographer at the center on Monday to see if he actually shows." Dean smiled, but the smile quickly faded. He wasn't trying to set Harold up for more embarrassment. He genuinely believed people could change if given the right opportunity, even people like Harold. The question was whether Harold would see this as an opportunity or just another humiliation to endure. 6 months had passed since the flight incident. The Chicago winter had settled in, bringing gray skies and bitter cold. Harold pulled his coat tighter as he walked from the bus stop to the South Chicago Tech Center, a journey that had become routine for him 3 days each week. Inside, warmth greeted him along with the familiar sounds of keyboards clicking and teenagers talking. He hung his coat and checked his watch. His class on business planning started in 15 minutes, just enough time for coffee. "Morning, Mr. Dalu," called a teenage girl with bright braids as she passed. "Did you grade our project proposals?" "All done," Harold replied, pulling the stack of papers from his bag. "Yours was excellent, by the way." When Harold had first arrived at the center 6 months ago, he'd been a nervous wreck. He'd expected hostility or, worse, mockery, the same treatment he'd given Dion on that flight. Instead, he'd found curious students who cared more about what he could teach them than who he had been. The center's director had assigned Harold to teach business skills, figuring his 30 years of experience should be good for something. The first weeks had been awkward and difficult. He'd never taught before, and his examples about yacht clubs and golf courses fell flat with kids who'd never left their neighborhood. "You're not connecting with them," the director had told him bluntly after watching one painful session. "Stop trying to impress them with your old life. Meet them where they are." That advice had changed everything. Harold started listening to the students, learning about their lives, their dreams, their struggles. He rewrote his entire curriculum based on businesses they might actually start: mobile app development, social media marketing, community-focused enterprises. Now, 6 months later, his business planning class was one of the most popular at the center. 5 of his students had already launched small businesses. 1 had received seed funding for her app idea. Harold settled into his classroom, arranging the proposal papers on his desk. The students filed in, greeting him with varying levels of enthusiasm. At the back of the room sat a new face: Dion, watching quietly. Harold's heart jumped. He hadn't seen Dion since that day on the plane. Their paths hadn't crossed during Dion's occasional visits to the center. "Good morning, everyone," Harold began, trying to act normal despite his nervousness. "Today we're discussing your proposals. I've reviewed them all, and I'm impressed with your creativity." The class went smoothly. Harold called on each student to summarize their business idea while he provided feedback. He'd learned to be both honest and encouraging, a balance he'd never bothered with in his corporate life. After class, Dion approached the desk as the other students filed out. "That was a good lesson," he said simply. Harold nodded, unsure what to say. "Thank you. It's good to see you, Dion. The director says you haven't missed a single day." "No, I haven't." Harold hesitated, then added, "I didn't come for the publicity." After the first month, no reporters showed up anyway. Dion studied him carefully. "Then why did you stay?" Harold looked at the classroom around him, the worn desks, the outdated computers, the brilliant young minds that society had nearly overlooked. "These kids," he said finally, "they're smarter than half the executives I've worked with. They just never got the chances I had." He looked down at his hands. "I've been given everything my whole life. I never earned any of it, not really. But here I'm actually doing something that matters." Dion nodded slowly. "My algorithm launches nationwide next month. Every school district in the country will have access. Kids like these won't be overlooked anymore." "I know. It's remarkable what you've accomplished." An awkward silence fell between them, the wealthy businessman who had lost everything and the young genius who had gained the world. So much had changed for both of them. "I never properly apologized," Harold said suddenly. "Not really. Not from the heart." "No, you didn't," Dion agreed. "I'm sorry, Dion. What I did, how I treated you, it was wrong. Not just because of who you turned out to be, but because of how I judged you without knowing anything about you." Dion was quiet for a moment, then extended his hand. "New beginnings, Mr. Whitfield." Harold shook his hand, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. Later that evening, Dean met Ling for dinner to discuss his foundation's latest initiatives. "I saw Harold today," Dean mentioned casually, at the center. Ling looked up in surprise. "Really? He's still volunteering there? I figured he would have quit months ago." "The director says he's one of their best teachers now. The kids love him." "People can change," Ling mused. "Even Harold Whitfield. His wife came back, you know. She's teaching art classes at the center on weekends." Across town, Harold arrived home to the apartment he now shared with his wife. It was small, nothing like their former mansion, but it felt more like home than that Showplace ever had. "How was class today?" she asked as they prepared dinner together, another new routine. "Good." Dean stopped by. She paused, knife hovering over the vegetables. "And?" Harold smiled faintly. I think we're okay." Later, as the city lights twinkled outside their window, Harold reflected on the strange journey of the past 6 months. He had lost his career, his wealth, his social standing, all the things he once thought defined him. Yet somehow, in that loss, he had found something far more valuable: purpose, meaning, and a chance at redemption. It had taken a 17-year-old boy to teach him what truly mattered in life. And for that lesson, painful as it had been, Harold was finally genuinely grateful.